Hello, thank you for watching the BiBism 101, Chapter 3, Skill versus Knowledge, directed by me, Jackie Chen. This is a non-academic source of information. However, I hope that it will be a source of your new intuition and spiritual power. So this time I pick this topic, skill versus knowledge, because I think it's relevant to everyone in a way that we all want skill and knowledge to be successful in our lives. And also in a way that we tend to lack some skill to acquire new skills these days, as we hear on the news media, where our employers are complaining and saying that they cannot find enough skilled laborers, which may be because of their tough financial situation, where they can't really afford to provide trainings to those new employees. However, I also think it may be because that people don't know what skill is really, so they don't know what to aim at when they're acquiring a new skill or knowledge. So I came up with these 4 different reasons for why this is happening, and why people tend to focus more on knowledge rather than skill. So the first reason is this notion of knowledge economy, which tells us that the more knowledge we have, the more successful we become in a quantitative way. The second reason is that knowledge has this notion of hard work. Skill may also be from hard work, but a lot of times people are just naturally skilled at something or talented at something without any actual hard work. So knowledge has a stronger sense of hard work. So we want to show off our knowledge, not only because we want to look intelligent, but also that we want to look diligent, and a hard worker. And so the third reason why people focus on knowledge rather than skill is that knowledge is easier to measure than a skill. So for example, if we are in a communication class, the teacher can measure our knowledge by doing some paper test or computer test and by scoring our answers. But when she is trying to measure our communication skill, that's going to be a lot harder. And so in that sense, knowledge is measurable, whereas skill is almost non-measurable. Finally, the fourth reason is that knowledge is more people-oriented, whereas skill is more of a individual work. So for example, study group is where people come together and then learn the same material or acquire new knowledge together so that it's more effective. Whereas think of a situation where people are learning how to play tennis. It's actually more effective to learn it from your coach directly rather than from other teammates with a bunch of people. Or you can even acquire new skill by practicing by yourself using a concrete wall. And so in that sense, knowledge is more collectivistic rather than skill, which is more individualistic. So these are the 4 reasons and why people like knowledge better than skill. And I think that is a problem, because skill can create knowledge, but knowledge cannot create skill. So if we are filled with a bunch of people with a bunch of knowledge with no skill, then we will eventually run out of knowledge, and which is what's exactly happening. What's happening today, where the rate of innovation and invention have been decreasing, according to some academia. And so let us focus more on something like skill rather than knowledge, once again. And so in order to do that, we have to understand the difference between skill and knowledge. And so if you look at this picture on the left-hand side, which describes skill and talent. By the way, skill and talent are different things, but for this particular presentation, I'm going to consider them to be the same thing. So these boxes represent different types of reality. visible, invisible, and visual. And skill is the kind of ability that can connect all these different types of reality, so to create new knowledge, which we may want to patent or copyright, etc. And and visible reality is like this animal bone, which is shown in this picture, which is called Ishangu bone. And this is something that people, as far as 20,000 years ago, developed in order to count something. And so that is a good example of visible reality, something that we can see through our physical eyes. And invisible reality, by using the same example of Ishangu bone, was the kind of expectation, motivation, or feelings that these ancient people had when they invented this new calculator. And finally, visual reality is a little bit tricky, but it's something that has a shape or color that people can visualize in their brains. But that doesn't mean that it's visible. For example, I don't know what ancient people called this animal bone back then, but today we call it Ishangu bone. So when I speak that word, I have to visualize the alphabets in my brain, which is ISHANGO, so that I can pronounce it correctly, or so that I can memorize it effectively. So that is the kind of visual reality that I'm talking about here. And so I put individual because each one of the individual elements in this picture can be a kind of skill by itself. For example, ability for us to visualize something in our brain is a kind of skill, as well as the ability to expect something and feel something is another skill by itself. And this line that is connecting these boxes, which represent our individual senses and logic, can be a skill by itself. And the only thing that's not a skill is this visible reality, because it's just a mere fact or reality. In this case, is this animal bone that existed back then. So with that being said, I want to move on to the next picture on the right hand side to describe what knowledge is. So knowledge often comes with all these multiple blocks of reality or boxes of reality that already has pre-established relationship or structure to it. So all we have to do is to memorize this shape without even thinking about these lines that are connecting these different boxes, which again represent this underlying senses and logic, which made this whole knowledge creation even possible to begin with. And so that is why I put collective here, because it exists collectively. These boxes exist collectively because they have already been connected. And I put psychological because what we do when we are acquiring new knowledge is to manipulate our brain or use our brain very effectively so that we can memorize and remember things that are new to us. And so these skill and knowledge are very different processes. Sorry about the interruption, but so what's really missing from the modern concept of knowledge is this underlying senses and logic that are other than our basic senses like vision and hearing, but something that's more ambiguous that can create whole new knowledge, as well as this invisible reality which ancient people had back then when they invented this new calculator. So let me use an example of the problem that existed in Japan a while ago, where students just memorized the whole textbook and didn't really think about underlying senses and logic, as well as invisible reality, which is like a certain human expectation or motivation. So what happened is these students can just easily forget the material that they just memorized, and so it didn't really help them to to improve their knowledge or skill. And another example is, say, let's think about this computer programmer, right? Who can has a physical skill to see a physical object right in front of him. Excuse me, which in this case is computer, right? Which is a visible reality. Going from the top, and the second box says visual reality, which is the fact that he can recognize this object and say it's a computer, computer, and finally the last box at the bottom is another visual reality where he can program calculator in the computer, and when he does that, he's probably using this visual images of different numbers in his brain. So anyway, so let's compare him and the ancient person who invented this Ishangabon back into 20,000 years ago. The difference between these people is that this computer programmer doesn't really need any theology in order to do his job or in order to survive. Whereas this ancient person who probably had great expectation and motivations and certain feelings about keeping a track of the number of items that he or she had back then by using this ancient calculator. And if this computer programmer had any kind of expectation, then that would be his idea of going to Hawaii for vacation, which is visual reality once again, because he's probably visualizing these beautiful beaches and coconut trees in his brain. And so the fact is that the invisible reality which people used to have back in the ancient time, such as again expectation and motivation, has been replaced by all these visible and visual reality in modern time or today, which in this case is a computer. So in other words, computer or technology itself became our theology or expectation. And this tendency to focus on things that are visible rather than invisible could also be cultural or traditional thing as well. As in the case of Japan, one of the major religions in Japan is Buddhism, and Buddhism has this religious practice, where people offer physical objects to their god, like in front of the Buddha statue. As opposed to other religions like Christianity, where people pray at a church without using any of those physical objects. And so Japan is traditionally, culturally, are very obsessed with this concept of knowledge and things that are visible or visual. And that is why Japan is really good at neurology as well as engineering. And a final example for this slide is the skill versus knowledge is like basic research versus applied research in science. So for example, basic research might focus on things that are invisible or something that's totally unknown to us and totally new to us, which didn't exist before, like say discovery of electricity or electromagnetic field, for example. And applied research, on the other hand, is they use all these previous discoveries or the research result from those basic research and use them to invent something like a computer or electronic machine and appliances. And Japan, I don't know about now, but they used to focus more on applied research. So they had to borrow all these research results or basic research results from other foreign countries in order to do their own applied research. So Japanese technology couldn't have been possible if it weren't for other foreign research. So let us focus on things that are invisible once again, and this is the global technology map, which I found on citylab.com, which I hope to back up this idea of individual theology being the key for innovation and inventions. So this darkest blue area are the most technologically advanced nations, so which I circled with this red circle. Europe is known to be an individualistic society. As archaeologists say, that this is where the individual household unit started out. So people in this region used to, or they live individually by the unit of a household rather than in a community like in Asia, where people live collectivistically. And Japan is also very individualistic, although some people might say that it's a collectivistic society. But Japan is very special in a way that it is, especially the Buddhism history. Who migrated from all the way from India to China to Korea to finally Japan. They always had this conflict with all the a lot of people along the way, and even after they came migrated to Japan, they had a lot of conflicts with Shintoists and Shintoism and Japanese imperial family, etc. So that is why Japan is very, very individualistic, because they had to be individualistic in order to survive through this conflict. And so finally, the United States is also individualistic. And if we look at these great movies, American movies in Hollywood, we can almost immediately tell they have a very strong sense of expectation and theology. And I would like to close this chapter by giving you this final example. Let's say you are watching this TV show like The Voice or American Idol and see all these talented singers, but you've noticed that not all of them are emotionally appealing to you. And you might say that, well, everyone's different and everyone has different opinions about arts and music. But the truth is that some of those singers who weren't really emotionally appealing to you probably didn't learn their own individual theology in order to make sense out of the music that they're singing, because they focused more on technicality or techniques of music, like how to make beautiful harmonies or how to make themselves sound good, things like that. So again, our ability to expect something out of life is a kind of skill, and let us focus on that rather than just the knowledge. If we really care about knowledge, then let's go back to the basic research. So as a last note, this 101 series is all about invisible concept of reality and make it really easy to understand for everyone by using all these visual aids. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you will continue watching other chapters. Thank you.